Zachy Hassan is your host on this most epic journey through pop culture's past. Hold on to your butts. This is Nostalgia Theater.
Brought to you by the Movie Film Podcast.
Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission, to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before.
Hi everybody, this is Zachy, and Star Trek Month is continuing here at Nostalgia Theater as we celebrate 50 years of one of the greatest franchises of all time. And for this episode, I'm ecstatic to be joined once again by my good friend Glenn Greenberg as we go through and watch the second pilot of the original Star Trek TV series. This is the episode Where No Man Has Gone Before. It's the first time we were introduced to Captain James T. Kirk, played by William Shatner, and this is the show that sold the series to NBC, and this is in essence what started the franchise as we know it today. Now, Glenn is an award-winning writer and editor whose work has appeared in such publications as Time Magazine for Kids, Scholastic News, Time Out New York, Back Issue, and Smoke. He's also worked for Marvel Comics and DC Comics on such world-famous franchises as Spider-Man, the Hulk, Silver Surfer, Thor, Iron Man, Dracula, and, of course, most pertinent for this discussion, Star Trek. He's written several Star Trek comics and novels, and he's one of the biggest Star Trek fans I know. My good friend Glenn Greenberg. Glenn, thanks for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me back, Zachy. I had a great time last time.
Well, so you have been a Star Trek fan all your life.
Pretty much.
So what was your first introduction to Star Trek?
Well, I have an older brother and sister who grew up with it. They were first-generation Star Trek fans. And when I was growing up in the 70s, it was on every night around 6 o'clock on Channel 11 here in New York City. And my sister and brother wanted to watch Star Trek. I was the baby in the family. I wanted to watch the Brady Bunch. More often than not, I won because I was the baby and they wanted to, my parents wanted to keep the baby happy. But I would say around 1976, 77, I started giving in a little bit and I was willing to watch Star Trek more often than the Brady Bunch. But it was really the first movie. My sister Ann took me to see the first movie, and that really sparked my interest. From that point on, whenever Pocket Books would put out a new Star Trek novel, I bought it. Whenever Marvel put out a new issue of the Star Trek comic book that took place after Star Trek the Motion Picture, I bought it. And it was really the novels that kept my interest going up until the second movie. Star Trek the Motion Picture is what really sparked my interest in Star Trek. Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan is what made me a lifelong fan. I was around 12 when that movie came out. But I had been familiar with Star Trek certainly before the motion picture, but that was where it really began for me. But Star Trek II, I fell in love with it from that point on.
I think that the story that you told is one that's probably echoed by a lot of other people, certainly as far as Star Trek II being the thing that turned people into lifers.
Yeah. Yeah, and I do have to add also, I was aware of the animated series as it was airing, and I certainly saw some of the episodes when I was a kid, but it wasn't something that I really sort of latched onto. I remember I had a talking Viewmaster, and my parents bought me the reels that had the episode where Spock goes back in time and meets himself as a child. So I certainly was familiar with that episode. And so Star Trek has always been in my life, but it really was the movies that I latched onto. And then, of course, in retrospect, then I went back and started watching all the episodes, and I loved that too.
So out of all the iterations of Star Trek, it's fair to say you have the most affinity for the original version.
Absolutely. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Yeah, I mean, I've seen every episode of The Next Generation. I've seen the bulk of Deep Space Nine. I only watched a handful of maybe no more than 2 episodes of Voyager, and I watched the first season and some of the last season of Enterprise. It's really the original series that I loved. I admire the Star Trek franchise. I admire the philosophy, the brand, and all that. But if I had to choose which one I couldn't live without, there's no contest. It's the original.
Well, with that in mind, let's go back to the very beginning of Star Trek. So what we're going to do, so I'm queued up on my end, Glenn is queued up on his end. I'm here in the Bay Area, Glenn is in New York, and through the magic of technology that I can only assume was inspired by Star Trek, we're able to talk to each other in real time.
Yeah.
So we're queued up to Where No Man Has Gone Before, and this is the second pilot episode. We'll explain why it's the second pilot and how that works. But if you're watching this on Blu-ray, it's the third episode. And also if you're watching on streaming, it's episode 3, Where No Man Has Gone Before. And so we're queued up on our end. So if you want to watch along with us, listeners, you can. You don't have to, because I think this will be a wide-ranging conversation just in general. But if you want to, we're about to start right now. So Glenn, I'm ready to go. Let's do it on 3?
Yep.
1, 2, 3, and play. And here we go. Now we're watching the remastered version of the pilot episode. Worth pointing out here that back in 2006, CBS went through and they redid all the visual effects on the original series so that they could upgrade the show to high def and allow it to remain syndicated forever and always until the end of time. So I think this is one of those instances where, unlike some of the stuff that George Lucas did with Star Wars, the effects are pretty seamless overall. They work pretty well, I think.
I don't have a major problem with them. I do think that the Enterprise looks very CGI. It doesn't have that solidity that the original model had. So given my druthers, I always gravitate towards the ones with the original special effects.
Yeah, I definitely get that. I miss the tactile nature of seeing actual models on screen. I feel like that's a bygone era at this point.
Oh yeah, absolutely, without question. You know, I still watch the original untouched versions of the Star Wars movies, just as a form of protest.
You've lodged your protest. I'm sure it's duly noted by Disney.
Yeah, absolutely, sure.
So this episode, okay, so it directed by James Goldstone, is written by Sam Peoples. It aired September 22nd, 1966, but it was the third episode to air. Now, this is actually the second episode of Star Trek produced, and the history here is kind of interesting, which is that when Gene Roddenberry came up with the original idea of Star Trek, the pilot that he got produced was called The Cage, and it had some superficial similarities to the Star Trek that we know, but it starred Jeffrey Hunter as Captain Christopher Pike, and it starred Majel Barrett as his first officer. And the only real through line was Leonard Nimoy as Mr. Spock. And the network said, thanks, but no thanks. However, they said, but go back and try again. Now, this feels like something that I in all the research I've done, I've never seen an instance of that before or since, where a pilot is produced and the network says, we'll give you more money, try again.
It was definitely the first time that had happened. It was the first instance where a second pilot was ordered. I do believe there have been instances of that since then.
Okay.
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what shows had second pilots produced, but without a doubt, Star Trek was the first.
Yeah, and it's almost like Star Trek. The stars were looking out for the show right from the start, because I think well, I mean, just looking at this show, I mean, I don't know that the Jeffrey Hunter version of Star Trek would have had the longevity that the William Shatner version of Star Trek has.
I agree because, well, it really depends. Certainly the way Pike was written in The Cage, and certainly the way Jeffrey Hunter played him, he was not a very dynamic character. He was not a very interesting character. He was a guy who was kind of burned out. and sort of at the end of his rope in terms of his career as a Starfleet captain.
Yeah.
Now, he's sort of gets his mojo again at the very end, but we never get to see Pike under normal circumstances, as he was before he kind of burned out.
Yeah.
So, who's to say? I mean, I don't know if Jeffrey Hunter could have played a sort of dynamic, a swashbuckling, lively kind of captain. I think that's one of the reasons why they hired William Shatner. Certainly, when William Shatner was brought in, he made a lot of contributions to the Kirk character, and I think a lot of what you see in that character came not from Gene Roddenberry, not from Samuel Peoples, but from William Shatner. So, the stories have changed over the years why Jeffrey Hunter was not in this second pilot. I think Jeffrey Hunter's camp would say, oh, he was not committed to doing television. But the other story that I've heard is that they didn't want him back. So the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. But
see, what I've heard, and I think this is in William Shatner's memoir. He talks about how they actually did want Jeffrey Hunter, but they couldn't deal with his wife's constant demands because I think she was sort of his de facto manager.
And I did hear that too. Yes.
Yeah. So I mean, this is one of those great we'll never know type of stories. But you wonder about the alternate reality where the show went to series with Captain Christopher Pike commanding the Enterprise.
Yeah, it's a thought that I've given. I mean, you can get a glimpse of it if you ever read like some of the novels that they've done where Pike is in flashback novels where it's Pike in command of the ship and it takes place like years before Kirk took over. And there's certainly interesting novels, but there's so little to go on in terms of Pike's backstory and his nature as a human being, his nature as a captain, that it certainly makes for interesting speculation. But I do think that maybe 50-60% of why Star Trek is so beloved, maybe even more, is because of what William Shatner brought to that role.
Yeah, and it's easy to undervalue Shatner's contribution to Star Trek. I mean, especially obviously there's sort of the larger than life Shatner persona that in some ways has almost overshadowed the straight ahead Captain Kirk persona. But I mean, when you watch these original episodes, I mean, it's fascinating to see the character being in the first episode right from the start, being who he was the entire time.
I couldn't agree with you more. And a lot of that did have to do with Shatner. I mean, Shatner had a lot of sway and he had a lot of influence on the script. And if you read the books about the making of, you see just how much he was looking out for the character of Captain Kirk. He always felt that Captain Kirk had to be the first person in the room. Captain Kirk was a hero in the classic mold. And so he had to solve the problems. He had to make the decisions. And yes, it led to a lot of bad feelings amongst the supporting players who felt that their roles on the show were being reduced to beef up Captain Kirk.
Yeah.
But it certainly kept Kirk very much in command. And the other thing I have to say is, watching The Cage, Jeffrey Hunter did not have much chemistry with anybody on that show. The chemistry between William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy is palpable.
Yeah.
It is just so strong right from the start. And I think that was a major part of the success of the show, whatever success it had during its original run. I don't think Spock would have been as popular a character if he didn't have Captain Kirk to play off of.
Yeah, and I think Leonard Nimoy, part of his shaping of the character was in direct response to the way William Shatner shaped Captain Kirk. I mean, it's the contrast of the fly by the seat of your pants and kind of very overtly emotional Kirk that allowed for the contrast of Spock being very again, the logical side of Spock, which isn't as much on display in the cage, to really emerge.
Well, I would say Pike is more like the Spock we know
Yeah.
than Spock was in the cage. And so, Leonard Nimoy sort of like played Spock as very over excitable and very hot. I wouldn't say hot tempered, but certainly very emotional.
Yeah.
I think possibly in contrast to the way Hunter was playing Pike. With Shatner, I mean, with all the histrionics and the emotion that Shatner brought to the screen, it allowed Nimoy to sort of back off and be more subdued. And that certainly was one of the key factors to why Spock was so popular.
Yeah. Now, as we're watching here, I mean, I'm noticing sort of these hinted at relationships. We've got Gary Lockwood as Gary Mitchell, we know he has a friendship with Kirk, but we see him kind of hold Andrea Drom's hand. She's Ewan Smith, and there's sort of the implication of this prior relationship between them, which I love, which they never follow up on.
Right.
And it's
Roddenberry was
No, go ahead.
Roddenberry was a big fan of doing that kind of thing where you would just drop in these little hints of backstory with no intention of ever expanding upon it. It just gives you a sense that this is a lived-in ship. These people have had experiences before, and they carry the scars. Spock is limping throughout the cage. They never explain why, but if you watch it carefully, you see Leonard Nimoy's limping. There's no reason for it other than, well, clearly on a previous mission, he was injured and he's still recovering from it.
And it's kind of interesting because the original Star Trek is the one and only iteration of the franchise where we never got the quote unquote first episode.
Right.
In that we just jump in, and this is, I mean, I think this is a year into the 5-year mission, or it's a ways in. I don't know exactly how far in. And they kind of expect you to figure things out as you go.
Right, and it works. I mean, that's the thing. It really does work. It's kind of amazing just how much we know about Star Trek was on display here in this very first episode with Captain Kirk. Kirk, I think, is completely fully realized as a character here. The only thing I would say is really missing from his character is that sort of devil may care, romantic ladies' man aspect. But everything else, I would say, is right here, right on display. I mean, Shatner kind of just stepped right into those boots with a fully formed character. The only thing that is sort of like at its beginning here is the friendship between him and Spock.
Yeah. And I love the fact that in relation to that, it's not a relationship that starts with them having antipathy towards each other. That's kind of that's the template, obviously, that the 2009 film followed, and that's sort of nowadays. That's it's like the Lethal Weapon thing, where you have these two guys, they hate each other, they become friends. I like the fact that these are just two guys, they've been assigned together, and
right.
and then as the show progresses, we'll see them become closer. But it's not like they disliked each other at the start.
Well, even the movie, I mean, I don't know how many of the novels you've read, but they did a novel about 30 years ago called Enterprise: The First Adventure. And it purports to tell the first adventure when Kirk takes over the ship from Pike. And you could see that he and Spock don't hit it off very well from the start. It's not like they are enemies the way they are in the first J.J. Abrams movie, but Spock gives serious consideration to transferring off the ship because he doesn't think that he's going to be able to work under Captain Kirk. So the whole notion that, they weren't swell with each other from the very start, for me, that notion has been there for, ever since I read that novel. Well, actually, there's a lot of things about that novel that I didn't agree with that sort of defied my expectations in terms of, how they all came together originally. But, it's not like the J.J. Abrams movie covered ground that had never been sort of postulated before.
Sure. Yeah, I'm aware of the existence of that novel. I haven't. My Star Trek novel reading is woefully inadequate. I'm sure if I were to stack it up against yours. So I remember there was a book called Final Frontier, which is about George Kirk.
Yeah, that wasn't one of my favorites.
See, and I never read the book, but I remember knowing, like that was the first time I found out that Kirk's father, his name was George Kirk. And if I'm not mistaken, that's the only time, I mean, it is never referred to in canon that his father's name was George Kirk before the film, right?
Right. I mean, you had the brothers, George Samuel Kirk. You're the only one who calls him Sam.
Right.
So I think it was just sort of author speculation that since Sam was, I guess, the firstborn,
Yeah.
it was logical to assume he'd be named after the father.
Now, as far as the story we're watching here, obviously Gary Lockwood would go on 3 years later to be in a very different kind of sci-fi production with, or not 3 years later, 2 years later, with 2001: A Space Odyssey. And, I almost feel like those are the poles of where his career remained. He's either thought of as Gary Mitchell or Frank Poole.
Not a bad thing to be remembered for, either one,
Yeah, and I think both are sort of, when you look at approaches to science fiction, I think this is sort of more of a humanist approach to science fiction, whereas, if you will, this is the Kirk approach to science fiction. 2001 is the Spock approach to science fiction.
That's a very good way of looking at it. Well, Stanley Kubrick, he was a very cold filmmaker. There's not a lot of humanity in any of the films that I've seen that he directed. It's people acting towards each other and just acting in general in a way that just didn't feel very human-like to me. It's a very sort of cold and unfeeling and dark. So it's that's a pretty good definition for Spock, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think both have their appeal, and I think when I watch this episode here and I look at Mitchell and sort of how passionate he becomes, and then you compare that with Gary Lockwood as Frank Poole, who is he's directed to be very sedate in his portrayal. I mean, it definitely gives you different approaches to the same types of subject matter.
Absolutely, and he was really good in both. I mean, that's the thing. I am kind of surprised that he didn't have more of a high profile career. I mean, he certainly kept working throughout the decades. You see him on the $6 Million Man, the Bionic Woman. Throughout the 70s, he was on a lot of different shows, but he never quite hit the big time. And it's kind of a shame because he's really good.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean he's still around. He's basically stopped acting as of like 10 years ago, but he's still. I mean, he's as of this recording, he's still with us. He's about 79 years old.
Yeah, he was on the short-lived Alec Baldwin talk show on MSNBC. He and Keir Dullea did a joint appearance together to celebrate the anniversary, one of the anniversaries of 2001: A Space Odyssey. And it was great seeing the two of them together, just sort of reminiscing about, the time that they had making that movie.
So you just described like a dream episode of Nostalgia Theater, is getting to talk to Gary Lockwood and Keir Dullea.
Well, you'd have to get in touch with Alec Baldwin to get their contact information.
I guess so, right? And yet I can see why MSNBC canceled that show, because I'm sure that's not the audience that they were hoping for.
No, I might have been the only person watching that night.
Now over here, this is Sally Kellerman, who would go on to become Hot Lips Houlihan in the MASH motion picture. And it's kind of interesting because I don't know if you have ever read the IDW comic book series set in the rebooted timeline.
Yes.
Of the feature film. So the first few issues of that book were actually an adaptation of this story. Mm-hmm. And they made it a plot point that, because I thought it was interesting how if we're talking about the rebooted the J.J. Abrams verse, or the Kelvin timeline as it's called, as compared to the original timeline, the story starts with very subtle differences, but as that series progresses, you see more and more how the further away we get from the prime timeline, how things are different. So in that storyline, by virtue of the fact that Dr. McCoy is on the Enterprise in that story, which he is not, by the way, in this, that accounts for Dr. Daner, played by Sally Kellerman, not being on the ship, and that accounts for how the story ends up going in a very different way.
Right, and I believe part of the reason why she's not there is because she transferred off the ship because she had an affair with McCoy or something like that.
Yeah, she had a prior relationship with him. McCoy, our man McCoy got around. He had a relationship with Dax, I think, also in a previous from Deep Space
That's right.
Now, worth pointing out here that the absence of Dr. McCoy in this episode is very acutely felt. We have Paul Fix as Dr. Boyce, Dr. Piper, who makes one episode and doesn't show up again, and it's you feel the absence of the irascibility of DeForest Kelley as Dr. McCoy.
Well, he would have grounded the whole thing in a way that none of the other characters present could have. He would have, with a wry comment or some kind of sarcastic remark, he would have grounded everything, more and put it into a different perspective, and kind of maybe taken some of the loftiness out of the sails, kind of thing.
Well, and I mean, you were talking about the relationship between Kirk and Spock and how important that is. I think you and I would agree that Bones is just as important a part of that mix, that alchemy that's made the original show so memorable.
Not at first, but by the end of the first season, yes. I mean, very much so. That's why I was so glad to see that restored in the new movie, Star Trek Beyond. They did a marvelous job bringing McCoy back to the forefront. And there's so many shots, and I just saw it again last night. There's so many shots in that film where they make sure that they've got the camera on Kirk, Spock, and McCoy together. Yeah. And I was so happy to see that because, yes, I would say by the middle of the first season, it had become pretty clear that McCoy was just as important to the show as Spock was.
So this is a kind of an interesting thing, right? Because as you said, it was not originally intended for McCoy to be sort of part of a triad. I mean, the opening credits for the first season only allow for William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy. And then in the second season, they elevated DeForest Kelley to the opening. What was it about, A, the character, and B, the performer that allowed it to happen so naturally? Because, again, it was not something that they necessarily had planned.
I think it started with the performance. I think when they brought on DeForest Kelley and they saw the way he was playing the role and the chemistry, the natural chemistry that he had with Leonard Nimoy, I think that it led the writers, and by extension, Gene Roddenberry, to see, we've got something going on here. We've got some magic going on here. Let's play to that. So I think it started with just the way DeForest Kelley was playing the character, and I think that the writers picked up on it, and they just gave him more to do. They gave him more to play, and they gave him they gave the episodes more opportunity to play around with especially the McCoy Spock dynamic, because those are the scenes where McCoy really did shine. His stuff with Kirk was terrific too, but the stuff with Spock was magic.
Yeah, and it's kind of interesting that they tried and failed to recapture that same kind of dynamic when they brought on Diana Muldaur as Dr. Pulaski in the second season of The Next Generation, and they tried to have her be the McCoy in a universe that didn't have room for that kind of character.
I agree. I also think that, to the fans, it seemed like they were trying too hard. They were trying too hard to duplicate something that couldn't really be duplicated, and that I think old time fans might have felt a little resentment. It's like, you know what? That belongs to the old show. Stop, cherry picking and sort of mining the old show to save, your current show, which at the time was kind of a mess.
Yeah.
I know as a fan watching those Next Generation episodes when they were first run, I'd always feel sort of a sense of, protectiveness or territorial whenever they would use special effects from the movies.
Sure.
They would show like the Enterprise D going through. Hey, wait a minute. Why are they going through the Matara Nebula? They shouldn't be doing. Or when they reuse the footage of the space dock. And it felt like they were strip mining the original. It's like, you know what? Stand on your own damn 2 feet. So I think that part of the reason why Dr. Pulaski did not work for so many people was because it was such a blatant attempt to recreate the McCoy-Spock dynamic. But I will say, I actually like Diana Muldaur as Pulaski. I thought she added a breath of fresh air to the show and added a certain sort of irreverence that the show desperately needed, because that first season was awful.
It
just
was dire,
awful.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's an even better word than what I used. Dire. And Pulaski brought some life to it. So I was disappointed that they didn't give her a chance to sort of blossom. And I thought that Crusher was okay when they brought her back. They seemed to know better what to do with her.
Yeah.
But I felt that Pulaski got a raw deal.
Well, I mean, just picking up on what you're saying, I think this is an interesting conversation in and of itself. When we look at the Next Generation, and certainly I would argue the other spin-off shows as well, we think of them much more as ensemble shows than the original, which is very much, it's a star vehicle for William Shatner, and we think of it as Kirk, Spock, McCoy. Why is it that the original show never evolved into more of an ensemble piece the same way the other ones did?
I can give you a very cynical reason that's probably true, which is William Shatner wasn't going to allow that to happen.
He was counting lines.
He was. I mean, I'm not speaking out of school or making stuff up. He literally did count lines, and if there was an episode where Nimoy had more lines, Shatner would hit the ceiling. He was very protective of the Kirk character, and by extension, he felt he was being protective of the show, I'm sure.
I think he was also protective of his positioning on the show.
Without a doubt.
Yeah.
I mean, it wouldn't be far from the truth to just say that there was a lot of jealousy on his part with regard to the popularity of Leonard Nimoy as Spock.
Sure.
It was not something that was expected. It was not something that he was prepared for, and it was something that was out of his control. And being put in that position, I'm sure he was very worried. I'm sure he was very concerned. And so, I mean, there are a lot of stories about, him behaving very badly in response to that. Whether or not those stories are accurate, it's the truth is lost to time.
Sure.
But let's just go with the assumption that they're partially true. Yeah, he was in a position where he was the star of this show, and he felt like he was being overshadowed by the guy who was supposed to be nothing more than his sidekick. And so, the scripts would come in, and Shatner, would use his influence to make sure that Kirk got the best moments, that Kirk got the key lines, that Kirk was moving the action along. There was just no way that it was going to become a full ensemble. And, it's, I'm trying to think of all the scenes, where the supporting cast supposedly had little moments where they would give a line of information, or they would have, a moment to sort of have a cute little human moment. And Shatner would call the director over, and they would huddle in the corner. And then all of a sudden the whole scene was blocked a different way. And Shatner would get that moment.
Yeah.
Walter Koenig talked about it. George Takei talked about it. James Doohan talked about it. Nichelle Nichols talked about it. They can't all be making
Where there's
it up.
smoke, there's probably fire.
Right, exactly. And supposedly he pulled the same stuff on the movies too.
Yeah.
So the original show, and I'll say something else. I mean, when I was writing the Star Trek comic books for Marvel, I went in with grand, sort of plans. And what I found is when you've got a limited amount of space or a limited amount of time, you have to cut the most non-essential parts. So there was one issue, I can't remember which issue it was, but I had a nice little scene that I wanted to do for Chekhov,
Yeah.
And
this is the Untold Voyages series, by the way, that you're talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the reality was I had a certain amount of pages to tell my story. What's going to go? Am I going to compromise the big action pieces that going to help sell the story? Am I going to cut scenes from Kirk, Spock, and McCoy? No, I have to cut the less essential scenes. And it was a nice little bit for Chekhov, but it didn't help further the story, so it had to go. So when you're dealing with the reality of, I guess in these days, each episode was about 50 minutes, you've got a limited amount of time, you're going to have to cut the stuff that's not absolutely essential. So yeah, the Chekhov moments and the Sulu moments and the Uhura moments and the Scotty moments, they're going to get cut.
See,
and that doesn't have a
of,
lot to do. Yeah.
I think for me, I look at the secondary characters and I think about how, in a lot of ways, at least in the minds of fandom, I think they became indispensable because of their inclusion in the films.
Right.
In that, we had Grace Lee Whitney, for example, show up in cameo appearances in a couple of the movies as Rand. If they had made her a regular in those films, she would have been perceived as just as integral in the big picture view. I think that when we look at the secondary characters in purely in terms of the show, I mean, we went like a whole half a season without Sulu and nobody noticed.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny because William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy did an interview with one another called Mind Meld that was sold on DVD a bunch of years ago.
Oh, that's right. Okay.
And Shatner raised the point that going to those conventions, you had throngs of fans cheering and honoring and worshiping Nichelle Nichols, George Takei, Walter Koenig, James Doohan, and telling them how wonderful they were and how they were there. That was, those characters were each one was their favorite character from the fans.
Sure.
And over the years, they start to think that maybe they were more important to the show than they actually were, that their contributions were bigger than they actually were. And I will tell you that, Walter Koenig did a guest appearance on Shatner's talk show a couple of years ago. Shatner's Raw Nerve.
Yeah.
And Walter Koenig actually agreed with William Shatner's assessment.
Huh. Wow.
He said, you know what? He said, I think maybe we did think more of our contributions than they really were. He said, I think you may have had a point about that, which couldn't have been easy for Walter Koenig to say, but it doesn't make it any less true.
Yeah.
You're right. Sulu was gone for half the second season. I think the movies did make those characters seem much more indispensable.
Yeah, well, and I mean, just we're talking about the contrast with these new films, and I know this is something you and I have talked about. I mean, Anton Yelchin passed away a month or so ago, and he plays Chekhov in the new films, and the question came up, should they recast the role of Chekhov? And my feeling was, well, no. I mean, the actor passed away. It's time to go. And there were certain people I spoke with who were like, no, you got to have Chekhov. And I said, I don't feel that way about the character. I mean, I think, I don't see him being that essential that we sort of, it becomes like a James Bond situation. You know what I mean?
Right. And also they've already got a ready-made replacement for him in this jailer character in the new movie. If they have to fill the spot left by Anton Yelchin's very unfortunate and premature passing, they've got this new dynamic, interesting character that could slip right in and take the spot that has been vacated, basically.
That's a good point. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's the contrast to me is extremely pronounced because when you look at Next Generation, which I still enjoy watching, but I mean that's definitely a star vehicle for Patrick Stewart, but it's much more egalitarian. When you look at the storylines on that show, Captain Picard almost guides us from one character to the next. It's rare. The mix of episodes that are quote unquote Picard episodes is no more than, for Geordie LaForge or Commander Riker or whatever. It's not the same as the original show, which the totality of the episodes are Kirk, Spock, or McCoy episodes.
And it's funny because the Next Generation movies, as you're saying that, the Next Generation was much more of an ensemble. The movies completely did away with that. I mean, there are some movies where, to a great extent. I don't think they were very good movies to begin with.
This is true.
But it's like, why even bother bringing back Gates McFadden when you're going to use her as poorly as they did in First Contact, for example?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I have to imagine that the non-Patrick Stewart, Jonathan Frakes, Brent Spiner actors felt a little bit of what it must have been like for George Takei and Nichelle Nichols, etc., in their movies.
Without a doubt, I'm sure they did. On the other hand, they did have plenty of time and episodes during their series to strut their stuff and show what they could do.
Plus, they all liked each other and they liked hanging out, which I'm sure helped.
Very true.
Now, see, we're talking about the history of these characters. Also, I love this character Kelso, who
he's one of my favorites. Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I really liked Kelso. I really, I to this day, I wish he had lived and stuck around.
Yeah, you have a sense of him and Mitchell and Kirk having this history that precedes this episode by quite a bit, and it doesn't take much. And I think this scene right here where we're seeing Kelso get killed. I mean, I think it works because we do have a sense of that history.
I agree. It was given a fairly limited amount of screen time. What we learn about these guys, we know everything we need to know. The camaraderie, the history, and so you do really feel a sense of loss when Mitchell kills him.
Yeah. And I mean, I think in story terms, and this can't be something that they had necessarily thought about extensively, but I mean, removing Mitchell from the crew allows for the Kirk-Spock friendship to blossom in a much more natural way. Because, I mean, the sense from watching this episode is that Mitchell is Kirk's, his bud. He's his compadre,
Best friend, and it's never stated on screen, but the implication is that Mitchell is the first officer.
Right, yeah, there's definitely a sense of he has a certain level of accord in the crew that allows for Spock to fill that void, essentially.
Right. Spock is, very clearly the science officer, but my suspicion is first officer, executive officer, whatever they thought of him at that time. In addition to being Kirk's best friend.
Yeah.
And in a very real way, that's why this works as such a great first episode of Star Trek, and should have been the first episode aired, because it does show the birth of Kirk and Spock's friendship and bond.
Well, and let's talk about that. I mean, this was the third episode aired. The first one aired was, I think, the sixth one produced, which is The Man Trap, which, by the way, is not a very good episode.
No.
Having just rewatched it recently. So what was the thinking there? Why not lead with I mean, if the pilot was enough to sell the show, why wouldn't it be enough to sell the show to audiences?
My understanding is that NBC wanted a Monster of the Week episode to start the show.
Okay.
Simple as that. They thought that a Monster of the Week would help sell the show.
And I mean, I would argue, and I having just watched The Man Trap recently, I mean, I think it's just a very weak episode. And if I was just tuning in completely cold, it would have done nothing to incentivize me to come back.
Well, you do know that the ratings for that first season weren't too good, so probably a lot of people felt the way you did.
Yeah. I mean, it's sometimes you look at the decisions that these network people make, and it's a head scratcher.
Well, you also have to think of the time. Science fiction wasn't well regarded as a genre on television. I think a lot of, TV execs saw it as kiddie stuff.
Yeah.
What else was there to go on? There was Lost in Space. I mean, the Twilight Zone was there, but I think that
Twilight Zone was like science fiction in secret almost. They
right. Right.
Plus, it had the respectability of Rod Serling to
exactly one of the greatest writers that ever touched the medium.
Yeah.
I will say that whenever I do my Star Trek review, when I rewatch the series from the beginning,
yeah,
I always do it in production order. I never do it in the order that the show is aired.
See, that's because I'm the opposite, because I'm kind of like, I want to experience it the way audiences did.
I want to experience the way audiences should have experienced it.
That's right.
Because there is a progression. I mean, yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, that's kind of the point is I mean, this is an era where it wasn't arc-based and serialized the way it is now. So, I mean, to the point that you're making, I mean, the producers had to know that whatever progression they instilled in would just as easily be shot to the four corners, whether they wanted it to or not.
Well, I just, trying to imagine watching, if I was watching Star Trek from the beginning in 1966, and I get through the man trap, and I guess I don't remember what the second episode to air was. Maybe it was the Corbomite maneuver. But you get through those two episodes, and then all of a sudden you're watching this one, and it's like, what? Okay, why are the uniforms different? Who's this guy, Gary Mitchell, that's all of a sudden supplanting Spock as the number 2 guy on the ship? What's going on here? It could not have been anything but confusing to audiences. And there's other things along the way. I mean, if you do watch the shows in production order, there are certain it's very subtle, but there are certain ththings that there is a certain sense of progression where, eventually they get the name Starfleet right. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's
what do they call it? USPA at one point?
USPA, yeah. At one point. Or Star Central or something, whatever. I don't remember off the top of my head. But there is a sense of progression, or the way they refer to Spock. He used to be a Vulcanian. Remember that?
That's right. And he had an ancestor that was human.
Right, exactly.
I think that's in this episode, actually.
Right. I just like the progression that it shows a natural evolution, whereas if you watch it in the order in which they aired, it's kind of like a mishmash.
Right. And that was a little bit by design, because in those days, if you wanted to syndicate a show, that you didn't want to lock in the local stations into what order you were showing these things in.
Although you watch this and you can't help but you can't help but notice this is the odd man out, this episode.
It absolutely is. But it's funny because we were talking earlier about how Kirk is so fully formed. I mean, look at this. This is a classic Kirk moment right here. The Kirk speechifying.
Above all else, God must have mercy.
I mean, it's great, and like we were saying, like it's certainly based on what we saw of Jeffrey Hunter as Pike. It's hard to imagine him playing these moments in the same way.
No, no, it would have been very interesting to see him try, but.
Now let's talk a little bit about Gene Roddenberry. Now you were talking before about sort of the perception that William Shatner had on set versus the character that he created. I feel like Gene Roddenberry has, to a certain extent, the myth has subsumed the man.
To a large extent, it did. I don't know how much it does now because so much has come out about him.
Yeah.
Over the last 25 years. I don't know how much of that myth is still holding amongst the fans.
Sure.
But for the longest time, yes. I mean, look, I was part of it too. I thought he was like practically a god, which is ironic since given the episode we're watching.
Yeah,
right now.
right.
But I thought he was this god who knew all and could do no wrong and was, the absolute brilliant genius who did it all by himself. And he did a lot to foster that, that notion. But over the years, a lot has come out in terms of what the real process was. And turns out he, like everybody else, had feet of clay.
Yeah.
And he wasn't a perfect person, and he didn't make all the right decisions, and he didn't make all of the creative contributions to Star Trek.
Yeah.
There were a lot of other people who made major contributions from the very beginning up until the day he died.
Yeah, I mean, I think his ultimate contribution is having created the framework that allowed so many other creative people to play in and make a mark that he wrongfully probably took credit for. But I mean, the framework wouldn't exist if not for his vision. So I mean, nobody can take that away from him.
And he did have the vision. That's the thing. He did have the vision, which is one of Harlan Ellison's biggest beefs against Roddenberry in the show. But I would say to Harlan, you're coming in to do a story within the framework of this man's vision. He has a vision.
Right.
And nobody can take that away from Roddenberry. I mean, he had a vision, and it was a vision that spoke to a lot of people.
Yeah. No doubt. And I mean, and by the way, worth pointing out here, this scene here where we have Mitchell making the gravestone for Kirk, that's one of the first instances of continuity errors where it's James R. Kirk.
You beat me to it, Zaki, because I was gonna bring that up too. I just was waiting for the right moment.
Yeah, and Roddenberry said, well, that's just proof that Gary Mitchell is still fallible. And I'm kind of like, well, that's almost proof of Gene Roddenberry being fallible more than anything, right?
I actually like that excuse that Roddenberry came up with more than any of the novels, the fan theories or the novel, the theories proposed in the novels as to why the gravestone was wrong. It was very simple, straightforward. And it made a certain degree of sense. I was fine with that.
It's a Marvel no prize solution,
Yeah.
It's something because unless you obsess about this stuff, you're like, oh, okay, and then you shrug and move on,
Right.
I actually, because to me, I didn't realize that we had novels that were going into and explaining that. I find that more bewildering than anything else because all it is a mistake. You just shrug your shoulders and get past it.
I think there were at least 2 or 3 novels that offered an explanation as to why the gravestone said James R. Kirk, and it's like, really?
Goodness,
you're wasting space on that. Okay, whatever.
That could be dialogue Chekhov gets. Now here, by the way, we have Kirk. In the first of many times his tunic gets ripped. That's a trope of this show, and that's something that, by the way, the new film Star Trek Beyond alludes to. Oh, my shirt got ripped again. And here, this is a moment I call it Spot the Stuntman, where you can. I don't think they intended for us to watch these shows on Blu-ray, where you can pretty much be like, oh, that's Shatner, that's not Shatner, that's Shatner, that's not Shatner.
I don't think anybody expected these shows to be watched more than a couple of times, and that would have been it.
That's amazing, and I mean, and by the way, this is the one and only time we get to see a phaser rifle on this series.
Yep.
I don't think we ever saw one again.
Not on this show, no.
Yeah, or in any of
it's also the last time
the films either. I don't think.
Oh, I think we've seen. Oh, you mean the original series films?
Yeah, in the new ones we did.
No phaser rifles.
Yeah, the one and
it's
only.
Also the last time we see Gary Mitchell, which is kind of. I have mixed feelings about that because on the one hand, he was very near a god.
Yeah. So
you would think that he could feasibly survive this and come back. On the other hand, unless there's a new story to tell, probably best to leave it alone.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it says something about the mark that he left in even just one appearance, that so much of the licensed fiction has sort of dwelled on his history with Kirk, and and they've really fleshed that out in that if you were to follow that stuff, I mean, you would have a wealth of material that really that gets into that.
And and I don't know if you're aware, but you probably are. But John Byrne did one of those photo novels that he's been doing. The first one he did was a sequel to this.
Oh, is that right? Okay. I have it, but I didn't realize, I haven't read it, so I didn't realize that that's what it was about. Was it any good?
It's
Did you like it?
it was okay. I
Yeah.
mean, it was okay. It I think the motivating force was to sort of, you know, give Gary Mitchell somewhat of a rehabilitation and sort of make it so that he was not. It was to redeem him in a certain way.
Sure.
And for what it was actually. Is it absolutely essential reading? No.
Mhm.
Does it make you think of him in a different way? Probably not. Is it a nice epilogue to this? Yes.
Okay. I'll take the nice epilogue.
Yeah.
And by the way, I mean, when you were at Marvel, there was the Star Trek X-Men crossover, which also brought
Right.
Gary Mitchell back.
Yeah. Scott Lobdell wrote that, and apparently, John Byrne's Gary Mitchell story was originally conceived as a full length novel, and Pocket was very interested in talking to him about doing a Star Trek novel. And once he saw the X-Men Star Trek crossover and that Lobdell Mitchell, he lost all interest in doing his story.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's my understanding.
Wow. So his
But
idea goes back quite a ways, that means.
Oh, listen. When I was doing my fan created Star Trek comics that nobody ever read, when I would write and draw my own Star Trek comics,
Uh-huh.
I had a Gary Mitchell return story in my head. So,
Everybody had one of those
it's
in their
not
back pocket.
yeah, exactly. But apparently, with the photo novel format, Byrne was able to do his story. I don't know if it's exactly the same story he would have done 20 years ago.
Yeah.
But he eventually did a Gary Mitchell story. But yeah, Gary was brought back in that Star Trek X-Men crossover, and I thought it was a pretty good job.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. I mean, for what it is, I mean, it's like a goofy one-off kind of story.
Exactly.
They've done a lot of those in comics. They did Star Trek and Planet of the Apes, which should not have worked. And
I'll tell you. That's exactly the way I say it. Is this should not have worked in any way, shape, or form? But for the most part, I loved it.
Yeah, so I read that to my kids, and my kids are familiar with both Star Trek and Planet of the Apes, being that they are in fact my kids. And there's a plot point in there where Dr. McCoy explains the concept of the slingshot, effect. To Cornelius and Zira, and then we find out in the story that that's what leads to them, ending up back in time for the third Planet of the Apes film. And the best thing, I love, kids are so uncynical. So my kids I read that to them, and they're like, oh, so that's how they ended up back. Like for them, like it filled in the gap.
Right, exactly.
Now it makes sense. They met Dr. McCoy, and he told them how to do. Oh, okay, now I get it.
And I got to tell you, I mean, there were moments where it was sort of like, oh, if they just, when they are going back to their own time and universe, if they just take Taylor with them, everything will be okay. And
Yeah.
It was just sort of great that I was able to have that moment where I forgot what ultimately is going to happen.
Well, you felt like a kid again.
I did, and I actually wrote to Scott Tipton, who wrote. I think Scott Tipton wrote that.
Scott and David Tipton,
and I wrote to. Yeah, right. I'm Facebook friends with Scott, and there was one night where we started chatting about it like around 11 o'clock, and I think we kept going to like 1 o'clock in the morning. I felt like a fan again. It was, and I give him all the credit in the world. He and his brother, they did a fantastic job with that.
Well, and speaking of being a fan again, I mean, here we are 50 years later, and I never get tired of watching these original episodes. And, I just sat here and I watched Where No Man Has Gone Before. I don't even know how many times I've seen it. And it still feels new. I still enjoy it. And you certainly, as you alluded to, you can't say that about a lot of TV that's half a century old.
You can't say that about a lot of TV that's 10 years old.
That's true.
It's the funny thing is as much as I loved the $6 Million Man and the Bionic Woman and the Incredible Hulk when I was a kid, watching them again, and thanks to the magic of DVD and Blu-ray and all that, you're able to watch them again in their entirety.
Right.
And I would say, and we talked about this, the last time we did this together. The Incredible Hulk, there are maybe 20, 22 episodes that bear repeated viewings.
Sure.
Man, there's probably even less. Star Trek, the ones that were good 50 years ago are the ones that are still good today. And out of the 79 episodes, the vast majority of them are really good and can and should be rewatched.
And even the bad ones are still fun to watch.
Even the bad ones have moments in them.
Yeah.
It's I mean, I got to tell you, The Way to Eden is one of the most watchable episodes because it's a train wreck.
It's true. The way to Spock's brain, right?
Spock's brain is a train wreck, but it's watchable. On the other hand, there are two episodes that are completely unwatchable. They were 50 years ago, they were today. And that is The Alternative Factor.
Sure.
And for me, That Which Survives is the only one that puts me to sleep.
Well, and when you think about it, 2 episodes out of 80, that's not, that's a pretty good ratio of bad to good.
That's a great ratio, yes.
Not too shabby. I think any TV show would long for that. I think when I think about it, as I mentioned at the outset, so many things had to go right for Star Trek to last. First of all, they had to get that second chance at the pilot. Second, they had to have the letter writing campaign to bring it back for a third season, which was enough barely to sell it into syndication. The other thing is that movie that was made in 1979 got made in enough of a window of time that they could bring back the original cast. Because you can easily see the scenario where they would have done a Lost in Space. And just, 30 years later, it's something entirely different. And, who's to say that would have lasted?
Well, that first movie, as you probably know, went through so many different permutations. And at one point, there was discussion of scuttling the entire original cast and bringing in, new people to play those characters. Supposedly, the studio was high on the idea of someone on the order of Robert Redford coming in to play Captain Kirk.
Wow.
There was, so this was the stuff that Roddenberry said in a very famous interview in Starlog magazine around the time of the first movie, that Paramount was strongly considering just not bringing back the original cast and having new people play those roles. It's that kind of Hollywood thinking, and in a very real way, the fact that the motion picture started out as phase 2. The pilot for a new Star Trek series for television, is what gave us back the Star Trek that we all knew and loved to a large extent.
Yeah.
Because with that cast already locked in place and a script already written, it just was easier for them to just throw that into production.
Right. So a lot of happy accidents and a lot of unforeseen things that ended up breaking in the right direction.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that the history of the show is just, fraught with that kind of stuff.
Well, I guess there's something to that. I mean, I think Star Trek was meant to be, and again, here we are 50 years later talking about it. And I think 50 years from now, people will still be talking about it. It is one of the most important myths of the 20th and now 21st century, and I don't think there's any likelihood that Star Trek, the franchise, the shows, or the movies will ever stop boldly going.
It will continue to exist in some way, shape, or form. The only hope that we as fans can have is that it will always have people in charge who understand what makes it work, why it's so important, why it appeals to so many people.
Very true. And I think that's a great place to leave this conversation. Glenn, thank you so much for joining me to celebrate 50 years of Star Trek.
I wouldn't want to spend it any other way, Zachy.
Well, as we're talking, you have a lot of Trek fiction that you've put out there. I'd love for you to put a plug out there for everything that you've done.
Well, I've done Star Trek Untold Voyages, which was a 5-issue miniseries for Marvel Comics that came out in, oh boy, I don't even want to say how long ago that came out, but it's out there. You can find. What's that?
It's about 20 years ago at this point, right?
Almost, yeah. I'd say about 18.
Wow.
Oh, that hurts. That hurts. But you can find the back issues in comic book shops or on eBay. They're very affordable. I also wrote 2 Star Trek novellas that were published as ebooks for Simon & Schuster. One was called The Art of the Deal, and the other was called The Art of the Comeback. And they were written for a line of ebooks called Star Trek Starfleet Corps of Engineers, and they were written in the same time frame as The Next Generation. So it features the Next Generation sort of universe. And those are the bits of professional Star Trek fiction that I've done. And I write about it on my blog a lot, Glenn Greenberg's grumblings.blogspot.com. I think my review of Star Trek Beyond is what's the most current posting, so it's up there if you want to check that out. And so yeah, Star Trek lives, and I love being a part of it in whatever limited way I have been, and hope to do more in someday.
Well, and as far as the Star Trek conversation here at Nostalgia Theater, it continues in 2 weeks, where I'll present my hour-long interview with Brandon Braga about Star Trek Enterprise, which celebrates its 15th anniversary, right around the same time as the original series celebrating its 50th. So lots of Star Trek conversation here. So yeah, Glenn, I'm looking forward to you listening to that one as well.
Oh yeah, I'll be there.
Well, and with that, that wraps up another episode of the Nostalgia Theater podcast. If you have any email or other queries you want to send me, you can write to moviefilmpodcast@gmail.com. You can also hit like on our Facebook page, which is facebook.com/moviefilmpodcast. Also, if you go to iTunes, Stitcher Radio, Google Play, TuneIn Radio, you name it, wherever you find podcasts, you will find this show waiting for you. But please do me a favor, if you are enjoying this show, go to iTunes, leave a star rating, leave a review, even if it's one word saying love. That's enough. Something that lets people know what you think of the show, and please spread the word. And with that, my name is Zachy Hassan. On behalf of my guest, Glenn Greenberg, this has been Nostalgia Theater. We'll see you next time.